The notebook was still open on the kitchen table when I walked back into the room, and Sam was standing over it with the candle shaking in his hand. He wasn't supposed to see it. Nobody was ever supposed to see it. For 3 years I had written my most dangerous thoughts into that cheap spiral notebook with the coffee-stained cover, always in the same corner of my desk, always tucked under a stack of bills where no one would think to look. But the storm had knocked the power out an hour earlier, and I'd sent him hunting for the flashlight in the drawer beside the table, and somewhere between the drawer and the candle he had found the one thing in my life I had never let anyone find. Eli. His voice cracked on my name. Is this? He stopped. He looked down at the page again, like he needed to read it a second time to believe it was real, and I watched his throat move as he swallowed. You wrote this about me. I didn't answer. Couldn't. My whole body had gone cold in a house that was already cold from the storm, and the only warm thing in the room was the small orange flame between us, throwing shadows up the side of his face. Rain was hammering the windows so hard it sounded like something trying to get in, or something trying to get out. Every page, he said, and his voice had dropped to almost nothing. Eli, every single page since the summer I got back from college. You wrote about the night on the pier. You wrote about my hands. You wrote. He pressed his lips together, and for a second I thought he was going to close the notebook and walk out into the rain and never speak to me again. That was the ending I had rehearsed in my head 100 times. Lying awake at 2 in the morning, certain that if he ever found out the truth, he would look at me like a stranger. Instead, he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, set the candle down so hard the wax jumped, and put both hands on either side of my face like he was afraid I might disappear if he didn't hold on. Say it's true, he whispered. Say all of it is true. It's true, I said, and my voice broke apart on the second word. He kissed me before I finished the sentence. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't the soft, careful thing I had imagined in the margins of that notebook, the kind of kiss I gave myself permission to write about only because I was certain it would never happen. It was hungry and a little desperate, his hand fisting in the front of my shirt like he needed something solid to hold on to in the middle of the storm, and I kissed him back with 3 years of silence finally breaking open in my chest. That is the moment this story begins. Not because it's the ending, it isn't, but because you need to understand exactly how much it cost both of us to get there before I take you back to where it started. My name is Eli Navarro, and until that night I had spent most of my life being very good at not saying the truest things out loud. I grew up in Renmore Bay, a fishing town small enough that everyone at the diner knew your order before you sat down, and quiet enough that a secret felt like it could be heard through the walls if you weren't careful. I learned early that some things were safer written down than spoken, which is exactly why the notebook existed in the first place. It wasn't meant to be a love story. It was meant to be a pressure valve, somewhere to put the feelings I couldn't afford to have anywhere else. Sam Whitfield had lived 2 houses down from me since we were both 8 years old, and for most of my childhood he was simply the loudest, fastest, most alive person I had ever met. The kind of boy who could talk a teacher out of homework and talk the tide out of ruining a sandcastle, or at least it felt that way when I was young enough to believe he could do anything. We built forts in the dunes behind his father's boathouse. We got matching scars on our shins the summer we decided we were professional cliff divers. We were, in every way that mattered to 2 kids in a small-town family. It didn't occur to me that what I felt for him had changed until the September I turned 17, when he came back from a summer working the deep-water boats with his uncle, tanned and taller and laughing in a way that made something in my chest tighten so hard I had to excuse myself from the dinner table. I remember sitting on my bed that night with the notebook open on my knees, writing the first line I would spend the next several years trying to explain away. I think I might be in love with my best friend, and I don't know what to do with that. I told myself it would pass. Didn't. If this had been a simple story, the kind where the 2 boys realize they like each other and everyone is thrilled and the credits roll, I wouldn't have needed the notebook at all. But Renmore Bay wasn't that kind of place, not entirely, and Sam's family wasn't that kind of family. His father, Daniel Whitfield, had built the town's largest fishing operation from nothing after Sam's grandfather lost the original boat in a storm, and he had very specific ideas about what the next Whitfield needed to become. A son who married well, took over the business, and gave the Whitfield name a future that looked exactly like its past. Sam had grown up hearing that plan recited like scripture, and by the time we were in our 20s, I had watched him fold himself smaller and smaller to fit inside it, the way a boy learns to make himself invisible in a house where love comes with conditions. So I wrote instead of spoke. Every soft burn romance has this part. The part where the truth sits in someone's chest for years, because saying it out loud feels more dangerous than swallowing it. Mine sat there for a long time. There was a night on the pier the summer we turned 21 that I still think about more than almost any other memory I own. We'd been drinking cheap beer out of a cooler Sam stole from his cousin's garage, our feet hanging over the water, and somewhere around midnight the conversation had gone quiet in that particular way it did when Sam was working up to saying something real. "Do you ever think," he said, staring out at the black water, "that we're gonna wake up one day and just be stuck? Like this is it. This is the whole life." "You make it sound like a life sentence," I said, trying to keep my voice light even though my heart was doing something complicated. "Maybe it is." He looked over at me then, and there was a version of that look I would spend years trying to decide if I had imagined. Something searching, something almost hopeful, like he wanted me to argue with him. "You ever want something so bad you're scared of it?" I remember my hands were shaking when I answered, and I told myself it was the beer. "Yeah," I said. "Every day." He didn't ask what. I didn't tell him. And the moment passed the way all the moments passed back then. Quietly, without either of us reaching for what was sitting right there between us. I wrote about that night for a week straight. He asked me if I ever wanted something so bad I was scared of it, I wrote. I wanted to say his name. I said yeah instead and let him think I meant something else. I am so tired of being a coward in my own life. That's the strange thing about a slow burn romance when you're the one living inside it instead of just watching it from the outside. It doesn't feel romantic while it's happening. It feels like grief with no funeral. Every year that Sam didn't know how I felt was a year I mourned quietly, alone, at my kitchen table with a cheap notebook and a pen that was always running out of ink because I used it too much. The years moved the way they do in a small coastal town, slow on the surface and fast underneath. Sam started working full-time on his father's boats. I took a job managing the hardware store on Main Street, the kind of steady, unremarkable work that let me stay close to the water, close to the town, close to him. We still saw each other most days. Coffee before his morning shift, dinner at his mother's table on Sundays, long walks along the breakwater when the weather was too rough for the boats to go out. And to anyone watching from the outside, we probably looked exactly like what we'd always been. Best friends. Inseparable. Nothing more. But something had shifted in me that I couldn't undo, and every ordinary moment between us had become, in the pages of my notebook, something I was quietly cataloging and grieving at the same time. I wrote about the way he laughed with his whole body. I wrote about the burn scar on his forearm from the engine room and how I'd wanted, stupidly, to press my mouth against it once. I wrote, more than once, some version of the sentence that would eventually become this story's title. He'd never read this. If he ever read my diary, I think it would either save me or destroy me, and some days I'm not sure which one I'm hoping for. The turning point, the real one, the one that set the ending in motion, came the winter Sam turned 26, when his father sat him down at the dinner table in front of the whole family and told him it was time to think seriously about Mara Doyle. Mara wasn't a bad person. That's important to say because this isn't a story about a villain. She was kind and steady, and her family owned the second largest fleet in Renmore Bay, which made her, in Daniel Whitfield's eyes, exactly the kind of match that would secure his son's future the way he'd always planned. Sam didn't love her. He told me that himself, sitting on my back porch 3 nights after the dinner, his elbows on his knees and his voice flat in a way I'd never heard from him before. "I don't love her," he said. "I don't even really know her. But my dad's already told half the harbor we're getting serious. And I don't know how to tell him no without it turning into a whole thing. So tell him no," I said, quieter than I meant to. "Sam, you can't marry someone because it's convenient for your dad's business. Easy for you to say." He rubbed a hand over his face, and for a second he looked so tired it hurt to watch. "You don't know what it's like, being the only thing keeping this family's whole future from falling apart. Everyone's counting on me to be exactly one thing, Elle. I don't think I've ever once gotten to just be what I actually want." I almost asked him then. I remember the words sitting right at the back of my teeth. What do you actually want? And is there any version of that answer that includes me? And I remember swallowing them instead, because I was terrified that if I said it and he didn't feel the same way, I wouldn't just lose the chance at something more. I'd lose him completely. 20 years of friendship, gone. Because I couldn't keep a secret to myself for one more conversation. So I said something safer instead. I told him he deserved to be happy. I told him I'd support whatever he decided. And that night, after he left, I sat down and wrote the angriest, most honest entry I had ever put in that notebook. Pages about how unfair it felt to watch the person I loved get slowly folded into a life that didn't have room for the truth. Pages about how exhausted I was carrying this alone. Pages that ended with a line I underlined twice. I don't know how much longer I can keep loving him quietly. It's starting to feel like it's killing something in me. I want to be honest about something here, because this is meant to be a true and heartfelt love story, not a tidy one. I don't think I ever intended for Sam to find that notebook. I wasn't performing my pain, hoping he'd stumble onto it and rescue me from my own silence. I kept it hidden specifically because I didn't want that. But there's a version of fate, call it luck, call it the universe running out of patience with both of us, that doesn't ask permission. The storm that changed everything rolled in off the water on a Thursday in early November, the kind of storm Renmore Bay gets maybe once a season. Strong enough to knock the power out across half the county and strong enough that Daniel Whitfield called all the boats in early. Sam showed up at my door around 7 that evening, soaked through, saying his own power had gone out and his mother had the generator running for the fish freezers and he didn't want to sit in the dark alone. I let him in without a second thought, the way I always had. We'd weathered 100 smaller storms exactly like this. The two of us on my couch with candles and old movies neither of us watched. And I had no reason to think this night would be any different. Except the power at my place had gone too. And when I asked him to check the kitchen drawer for the flashlight while I found matches for the candles, I forgot, genuinely, carelessly forgot, that I'd left the notebook out on the table the night before, open to a page I hadn't finished writing. I heard him go still in the kitchen before I heard anything else. That particular silence, the kind with weight to it, the kind that makes the hair on your arms stand up before your brain even catches up to why. By the time I walked in with the candle, he was already reading, and it was already too late to take any of it back. You know what happened next? The kiss in the kitchen, his hands on my face, 3 years of silence breaking open between one heartbeat and the next. But a first kiss isn't the end of a story like this one. It's barely even the middle, and what came after was harder, in some ways, than everything that came before. We didn't sleep that night. We sat at my kitchen table until the storm passed and the power flickered back on, and we talked in the way two people talk when they've spent years rationing the truth and suddenly there's more of it than either of them knows what to do with. He told me he'd noticed things too. The way I went quiet whenever Mara's name came up. The way I always found a reason to stand a little closer than I needed to. He told me he'd written it off as his own imagination more times than he could count, because the alternative had felt too dangerous to hope for. I kept telling myself I was making it up, he admitted, somewhere around 2 in the morning. His hand wrapped loosely around mine on the table like he still wasn't sure he was allowed to hold it. Because if I was wrong, I'd lose you. And if I was right, he stopped, shook his head. If I was right, I didn't know what I was supposed to do with that. Not with my dad. Not with everything he's already planned out. You still don't know, I said gently. Nothing about tonight makes that easier. No, he agreed. But it makes it real. And I think I'd rather have something real and complicated than something safe and empty. That was the first night of the second half of this story. Not a fairy tale ending, but a beginning that came with its own weather. Because loving Sam Whitfield openly meant reckoning with everything he'd spent his whole life being told he had to be, and I won't pretend the weeks that followed were easy. He ended things with Mara first, gently, honestly, and to her enormous credit she told him she'd suspected for a while that his heart wasn't in it. A small mercy in a story that could have gone so much crueler. His father was a different matter entirely. When Sam finally sat Daniel down and told him the truth, not just about me but about all the years he'd spent trying to be someone he wasn't, the silence in that house lasted so long. Sam told me later he thought his father might never speak to him again. There was shouting, eventually. There was a door that got slammed hard enough to crack the frame. There was a stretch of almost 2 months where Sam and his father barely spoke, where Sam moved his things into my spare room and we lived in a strange, tender, uncertain in-between, both of us grateful for what we'd found and both of us aware of what it might cost. I won't tell you it resolved itself easily because that wouldn't be honest, and this is supposed to be a true story about what it actually costs to choose yourself. But something in Daniel Whitfield cracked open eventually. Maybe it was watching his son come home lighter than he'd looked in years. Maybe it was Sam's mother quietly reminding him every single day that a business built on his son's misery wasn't the legacy he thought it was. 6 months after that storm, Daniel showed up at my front door on a Sunday afternoon, stiff and awkward in the way of a man and used to apologizing, and asked if Sam and I would come to dinner. It wasn't a grand reconciliation. It was a plate of pot roast and a lot of careful silence, and, near the end of the meal, Daniel clearing his throat and telling Sam, gruffly, that the boat needed a second name on the deed eventually, and he supposed it might as well be someone who actually made his son happy. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to build on, and in a story like this one, enough is sometimes the most honest kind of happy ending there is. These days, Sam and I live in the same house on the same street where I used to write about him in secret, except now the notebook sits open on the kitchen table without anything to hide, and some nights he reads over my shoulder while I write, laughing about how much of our whole life he'd apparently missed while it was happening right in front of him. We got married 2 summers ago on the pier where he once asked me if I ever wanted something so bad I was scared of it. I stood there and told him the truth in front of everyone we loved, that I had been scared, for years, of exactly this, of wanting him too much to survive losing him, and that the bravest thing I ever did wasn't writing it down. It was letting him read it. People sometimes ask me, now that the whole town knows the story, whether I regret how long I waited, whether I wish I'd said something sooner instead of hiding behind pages and pages of quiet longing. I used to think I would answer yes, but the truth is more complicated than that, the way every real love story is. I don't think Sam and I would have found each other the same way if I'd forced the truth out before either of us was ready to hold it. Some doors only open when the person on the other side is finally brave enough to walk through, and until that storm, neither of us was. What I know now is this: love that's true enough to survive silence is love worth waiting for. And sometimes the bravest, most honest love story isn't the one you speak out loud first. Sometimes it's the one you're finally brave enough to let someone read.